Hello everybody and welcome to the next session. Let's discuss some of the quantitative research methods in today's session. Now, as we have already defined, research methods are nothing but collection of tools. But then what are the requirements before we start the analysis? Before we start the analysis, we need few information. What is the first information? That we have to define the variables that are directly observable. Secondly, we have to define their scale. Third, we have to collect the information and which is called data collection, and fourth, then we decide which method is to be used. So, these are the four major steps before we start with the analysis. For instance, let me give you an example. Let us say I wanted to analyze the demographic profile of the class of the 40 participants. Now, look at the word demographic profile. Is it directly observable? The answer is no, which means I cannot collect the data on demographic profile directly. So, what is the thing I have to do? I have to break it into smaller components. So, what are the smaller components? Maybe I am interested in your age, in your gender, in your annual income, or let us say the number of family members at home. Now, these are known as variables which are directly observable, and collectively all these variables gives me your demographic profile. So, what is the next step? Then I put these questions maybe on a piece of paper, which actually say it is a questionnaire. I administer this questionnaire to all my participants. You fill it up, I get the information. So, this is my data collection, and then I start analyzing the data. Maybe now I can compare, okay fine, with this kind of age group, if this is the income, annual income, and this is a gender, you fall into one particular section of the society. So, please remember one thing, it is a very important point to remember. You have to define a variable very clearly. It should be directly observable also. Only when you will be able to measure it. And please remember one more thing, if something is not measurable, cannot be studied. Now, in statistics there are two types of variables. We classify them into two broad categories. One is known as quantitative variables, the other one is known as qualitative variables. Now, as the name suggests, quantitative variables are those variables which can be quantified. For instance, I can quantify your income, I can quantify your age, I can quantify the demand, I can quantify the supply. So, these are known as quantitative variables which can be represented by a quantity or a number. But then there is another category of variables which cannot be quantified and are known as qualitative variables. For instance, if I ask your gender, your answer would be male and female, which cannot be quantified. If I ask you what is your religion, again it cannot be quantified. For instance, your religion would be Hindu, Muslim, Sikh, Christian, Jainis and Buddhist, something like that. If I ask your designation, it cannot be quantified. If I ask you what is the state of your origin, again it cannot be quantified. But having said so, we try to quantify them and only then we can measure it. But then it has a different technique, and that technique is known as scaling technique. Now, there is third kind of variables which are not directly observable. For instance, can I measure happiness directly? Can I ask you these questions, are you happy or not? Can I say that your happiness is between 1 to 10, it's in a 9, or let us say 8.5? It is not so possible. So, these are called latent variables. Some of the latent variables could be integrity, corruption, emotional intelligence, etc. But even these variables can be quantified and can be analyzed by using appropriate statistical techniques. I will give you some examples where the latent variables have been used. For instance, gross national happiness. Now, you cannot measure happiness directly, yet we have the ranking of the countries on basis of happiness. We also have report by Transparency International on the corruption. We also have ranking of the countries on corruption. Now, corruption cannot be measured directly. It also has certain variables. Similarly, we have the Global Competitiveness Report, which has 103 variables indicators that have been studied to give the ranking to the various countries. Therefore, before we actually apply a quantitative tool, the researcher has to use a proper scaling technique. There are 4 different scaling techniques. These are known as nominal scale, ordinal scale, interval scale and the ratio scales. Now, all these scales have been dealt in detail in my PPTs. You can go through the PPTs. Now, let us come to one of the restrictions of the quantitative tools. The tool which can be used on one scale, say a nominal scale, cannot be used for the ratio scale. For instance, let me give you a small example. We are all familiar with two graphical representation. One is bar chart, the other one is histogram. Have you ever realized what is the difference between these two, or when to use which graph? Let's say I have to plot the gender distribution of the class. Which one should I use? Should I use a histogram or should I use a bar? The answer is bar chart. I can't use histogram for this. But have you ever realized why? Whereas if I have to plot your income, which has been measured in its annual income, which has been measured in thousands and lakhs, can I actually use a bar chart? The answer is no, I have to use a histogram. So where is the difference? The difference is how these two variables have been scaled. Now if you look at the gender, it has been measured on a nominal scale, whereas your annual income, which has been measured in thousands or in lakhs, has been measured on a ratio scale. So two simple graphs which you are familiar with, they are not interchangeable. So every tool has this limitation. For instance, I cannot calculate the average or mean of your gender, but I can always calculate the average for your annual salary. This holds true for all quantitative tools that are available with us. So this is a thumb rule, this is a generic rule. They are not interchangeable. Therefore, I would like to emphasize on this aspect that tools get decided much before the data collection, because before the data is collected, we define the scales and then only we put it on the questionnaire. Whether it can be questionnaire or whether it can be some different kind of technique for collection of the data, but the scales are decided before we ask the questions. So tools cannot be decided at later stage. Tools should be decided in the beginning itself. Now let us look at the statistical techniques and tools that are available with us. Basically the statistical tools are categorized into two parts. One is called parametric statistical tool, the other one is known as non-parametric statistical tools. Now, each category comes with a set of assumptions, with a set of conditions which are fixed, which are not flexible. Therefore, a thorough knowledge in statistics would help a researcher to decide which tool is to be applied for the best result of the research. With that, I would like to thank you for listening to this session. Thank you very much.